Today, I'm thrilled to kick things off with Sascha Gill-Chugh, Communications Manager at CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education. We'll be talking about Sascha's career, her achievements, and what's next on her journey. So let's dive in. Hi, Sascha. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Vishnee. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, to just tell you a little bit about Sascha, she is a social impact communications professional with 8 years experience leading comms and campaigns for global not-for-profit and purpose-led brands. She is currently communications manager at CAMFED, NGO working on advancement of girls' education and women's leadership across Africa. She's also previously held roles at Plan International and the International Rescue Committee, where she led strategic comms for partnerships with major global brands and helped deliver the IRC's 2023 Anthem Award-winning World Refugee Day campaign. Sascha began her career in corporate social responsibility and brand communications. She's passionate about gender equality, decolonising international development, and the role of business in driving social impact. So welcome again. Great to have you. So tell us a little bit about your career journey. How did you find your way into comms?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I fell into comms, as I think many people do. So I didn't even know what communications was when I was at university or at school going through the process of picking my degree. I actually went to university to do a law with French degree of Indian background. So the only choices really were doing law, engineering, or becoming a doctor. And I loved kind of reading and writing, and law was the one that ended up pursuing at university. I thought I was maybe going to be a corporate lawyer at one point, but during my time at university, I really enjoyed the kind of researching, writing, kind of debating complex issues side of doing a law degree. I also got involved with the student newspaper as well. That was my first introduction into comms and journalism and that whole area, which I really enjoyed doing. Once I graduated from university, I was lucky that my parents lived near London. So I was in the right place to find graduate jobs. And I ended up falling into a comms and marketing role in a startup luxury tour operator in the travel industry. So very different from not for profit, but it was a great experience because I was working in a startup. It's the kind of environment where you're involved in everything. So I was doing PR, social media, CSR comms. My head of marketing at the time, Layla Alkatan, was really encouraging and saying, I think you could make a career out of this. You have really good potential in comms and your comms skills. And I was really young. I think I was 23 years old and running the corporate social responsibility comms and social media for the company. So I got thrown into the deep end. But it was a great learning experience. And then from there, I really enjoyed that job. But unfortunately, in 2020, the travel industry got hit very badly with COVID-19 and that company ended up folding. So I had to rethink what I wanted to do. And I've always been interested in communicating for a cause and kind of social impact. So during my time at university, I did a few modules on international human rights law and spent a year living in Strasbourg in France, learning about kind of EU law and the European Court of Human Rights and things. So I think I always had that interest. And towards the end of my time in the luxury travel industry, I was getting quite frustrated that customers were complaining about thread counts on their pillows and things like that. And I was like, oh, that's not really the biggest issue in the world. So I decided to go and do my master's in international development at SOAS. And then from there, combined my experience in comms with my interest in social impact and international development and ended up working for Plan International UK after my degree. And then, yeah, since then, I've always been in the international development sector in various comms roles. Started off on the digital side of things as a website editor and then moved into partnership comms at the International Rescue Committee, which is what I specialise in now at CAMFED too. So yeah, it's been a bit of a roundabout journey, but an interesting career so far.
Yeah, I had a guest on a few weeks ago who said none of us planned to go into comms, like your first choice, but you end up understanding it and loving it. And maybe it's because people don't know what it actually is, that there's a very high level strategic side of it that people don't understand. They think it's just social media or press, but there's so much more to it. But no, I think that's brilliant. And it sounds like you found your kind of niche with international development and the different organizations that you're working for now. So, can you tell me a little bit about a campaign maybe that you're proud of and why, and how did it work?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you say that because I think my dad still thinks I just write things on websites. But anyway, in terms of campaigns, I would say There's probably two that stick out in my mind. One of them is a campaign called Crime Not Compliment, which I worked on at Plan International UK. It was an advocacy campaign focused on bringing the issue of public sexual harassment to people's kind of awareness. It was something that a lot of girls and young women in the UK were facing, being catcalled on the streets, and no one was really doing anything about it. So our campaign was run in collaboration with a grassroots organisation called Our Streets Now, who are a youth organisation doing a lot of campaigning on the issue. And the aim of the campaign was to get a law passed that criminalised public sexual harassment. And the whole idea was that it was a crime, not a compliment, for someone to receive unwanted attention or being catcalled. So it was a really interesting campaign in terms of translating quite a complex policy issue into external messaging. And my role was leading the digital side of things. So coming up with snappy social media captions that didn't turn people away, but also highlighted how serious the issue was, and also helping translate some of the research and some of the stats that we had been working on with our research and advocacy teams onto kind of news articles that we could put across our website. And I think it was a really interesting campaign because we did a kind of experiment in terms of the imagery that we used. So we didn't use real people's imagery. We used graphic illustrations of girls and young women, and we purposely made them quite diverse. So we had different races, different people living with disabilities represented in the imagery. And I think that really helped to get people from different lived experiences interested in the campaign because they could really see themselves represented in it. And it ended up getting, I think it was like 10,000 people signed the kind of hand raise action that we had. And then eventually, by the end of the campaign, a bill was actually passed in Parliament called the Protection from Sex-Based Harassment Bill. So it achieved its aim, really, and ended up changing the law on public sexual harassment, which was really cool to see that it did that. Yeah, that was an amazing experience. And then slightly different, more of a brand campaign, which is what you mentioned earlier, is that during my time at the International Rescue Committee, I was involved in their annual World Refugee Day campaigns. And in 2023, I was leading the partnership comms team and the partnership comms element of a campaign called Refugees Are Change Makers. And at the time, there was a lot of rhetoric in the media and in the news about immigrant communities and refugees are coming over and taking our jobs, like in the US and the UK and other places. And our aim with that campaign was to really highlight that refugees bring change, but it's good change. Like everyone has their own kind of experiences that they can bring to a new community, and it makes it a much better place to be. My role was to get that message across to our corporate partners, and obviously each corporate partner is very different. So we were working with people like Duolingo, Pfizer, City Foundation, very big brands that don't necessarily know much about kind of World Refugee Day or kind of the refugee. I don't like calling it a refugee crisis, but that's, I can't really think of what else to call it at the moment. But I think at the time as well, there was more than 110 million people that had been displaced. So it was a really big issue, and it still is. It was a great learning experience in terms of how to translate that into kind of brand first content and kind of fun thought leadership with some brands. Like we partnered with Marriott International CEO and the IRC CEO on kind of a thought leadership article that they wrote about getting refugees into the hospitality industry, and all the way to doing a fun quiz on BuzzFeed's website. So it was a really big range of activations that we ended up partnering on. But around, I think there was over 40 brands ended up partnering with us on that campaign. And it was really great to see so many different organizations come out in support of World Refugee Day that year. And we ended up winning an Anthem Award for it, and it reached over 20 million people across digital channels. So it was a great campaign, and one that I'll probably remember for quite a long time.
World Refugee Day is a big day, kind of internationally. I've been involved in it in various guises, but I think you're right. It's one of those topics that is ongoing, right? At the moment, we're hearing about people who are being displaced right now in their circumstances, and it doesn't feel like that's going to change. So being able to try and combat people's thoughts and what they're hearing and that misinformation that they're getting, it's great that you've got a campaign that could cut through and use businesses really to help you do that. Fantastic. Brilliant. So on the flip side of that, what has been your toughest challenge that you faced in communications, and how have you handled that?
Yeah, when I was reflecting, there was one particular instance. So last year in 2025, I'm sure you and many of your listeners would be aware that there was massive aid cuts in kind of the US, and Trump's kind of executive orders meant that the sector was really going through quite a tough time, which was a challenge in itself. But I think the particular challenge I was facing in the organization I worked for was that to comply with Trump's executive orders, we had to really change a lot of our language around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We had to strip quite a lot of the mentions of it off our website. I had to be very careful about what we were putting out externally, just because we didn't want to put a target on our back, even more than there already was. I'm quite a big advocate of DEI, and I tried to make all the comms I'm doing inclusive and equitable and make sure people are being represented in the right way and that the organizational values are really coming through in any comms that I'm doing. So I think as someone who is quite passionate about that area, it was quite difficult for me to see that happening as a leader, communicate that, oh, we actually can't say that externally. Maybe we need to edit this language a little bit. And I think it was an interesting challenge because even though it didn't align with my own personal values, you could understand the reasoning behind why we might have had to do that. So I think it was an interesting learning experience in terms of, especially within international development and kind of the political climate. I'll try not to get too political, but in terms of the political climate that we're facing at the moment, I think it's difficult to balance your own values with making sure your organization is protected and making sure you're not a target, because then the communities that you're trying to serve, obviously the effects affect them in the end rather than just your organization. So I think it was definitely challenging to go through that period and tweak our messaging in a way that still rang true to our organizational values, but in a way that kind of helped maybe not put a target on our backs as well.
Yeah, this has happened to so many not-for-profits, but also businesses. I've heard about businesses who have deliberately taken DE&I off the table because they are having to protect themselves and they are feeling the pressure. But then there have been organisations who steadfast have kept to their morals. But it is a very difficult position when you are looking for funding and needing that funding, I guess, and there is no alternative in that sense. But no, that's really difficult. And it's ongoing, isn't it? Just the same with most charities. I think the charities are now thinking about not trying to avoid government type funding and looking at other kind of trusts and foundations, but it's still very challenging for everyone.
Yeah, it's tricky. I think even things with like climate change and how people are communicating about that as well for government funding, that's also something that I think a lot of charities are grappling with in terms of how to communicate about that externally too. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting time.
You mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. You and I have had some nice conversations about making change and thinking about the international development sector as a whole. And you're passionate, and I am too, about decolonisation. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts around that? What it means for some of our listeners might not know the international development world and what you're hoping to achieve from that.
Yeah, I think we could have a whole podcast just about this. So I'll try and keep it short and sweet. But essentially, decolonising the aid sector is a movement that's all about stripping away the kind of colonial beginnings of international development. So for those who don't know, the international development sector or the aid sector really has its roots in kind of a lot of, like missionaries. So a lot of Christian missionaries going to countries in kind of Latin America, Asia, Africa, and kind of spreading Christianity. That's one side of it. And then the other side is a lot of countries that we now consider to be low to middle income countries are only low to middle income countries because of colonialism and being part of the British Empire and things like that. And the fact that a lot of what you would consider Western countries going in and stripping away a lot of riches from those countries. So it's interesting because as a result of that, I think the international development community and the aid sector, a lot of those kind of beginnings have seeped into how people operate. So a lot of the big international NGOs are headquartered in New York or in kind of Geneva or the US. And that means that they're often quite far removed from the realities of what's happening on the ground. So I think that connects to comms and kind of their external representation of the communities that the international development sector works with, is that it's sometimes an us and them kind of thing. So you can see a lot of imagery. I think you've mentioned it previously, Vishnee, on your podcast about how there's often kind of images of young African children with like flies in their eyes and looking very helpless. What I would like to see change, and I think some organizations are doing it quite well, is to have communities be able to tell their own stories in their own words and really put them front and center. And a lot of them are actually making change in their communities. A lot of the young girls and women we work with at CAMFED are running businesses, or they are the first girl in their whole family to ever go to school or university. And now they've become doctors, and now they're passing it on to the next generations. I think I would like to see the section move away from the narrative of communities in Africa and Asia being helpless and needy, and more towards their kind of taking control of their own futures. How can we support them to make change in their own communities? And I think that would help to make the sector more sustainable as well, because I think we saw a lot with the fact that there was a lot of rhetoric around the US aid cuts and kind of other government aid cuts, and how really if we were empowering more low to middle income countries to run their own development programs, then maybe the effects wouldn't have been as catastrophic because it wouldn't be relying on just one funding source. So I think someone said to me when I first joined the international development sector, maybe it was at SOAS actually, was that really you want your charity to not need to exist, should be the end point of everything you're trying to do. And I think that understanding hasn't really made it across the whole sector yet, I would say.
Yeah, and I think there's this sort of cycle, isn't there, of fundraising and program work, which I think is very good. But there is that idea of, oh, we're not here to raise money, we're here to make a difference. And as you say, in order to not exist anymore. For me, that's the ultimate goal, that you don't need these charities and not-for-profits to be around. And your point about how far they are from where things are happening is so true. I've worked for big organizations and our head offices are in London, or as you say, in Europe or somewhere in America. However, the work is not happening there. And I've been fortunate enough to go and visit a lot of the work that we've been involved in. And it's truly amazing work, but that's not what the story that's been told, because the story that's been told is what raises the money. And we're in this cycle of needing to tell that type of story. But actually, a guest that I had this week, we put out like yesterday, was about the narrative and being able to say, she was talking about homelessness, and it's not an old man with his dog. There are families on the streets. Let's tell real stories. Let's tell what is actually happening. Let's celebrate the achievements and say, because of the money you're donating, this is what we can do. And I think people will much rather that than that kind of tugging on the heartstrings of, we need money because these people are poor, because that's not the right story that you're telling. And as you say, colonialism obviously has, big powerful countries have been stripped of all their resources, as you say, and are coming back now. And so for me, it's about empowering people to tell their stories, being able to tell what's happening. I worked at the Age International, and we talked a lot about older people. And older people are not there just to be old. They're the leaders of their families. There might be leaders in their communities. I'm proud of that. And I had to tell a story about, we were trying to gather case stories about women who were not paid to do work. And this one woman said to us, actually, I like being the community leader, even though I'm not paid for it. That empowers me. That makes me feel good. And so we told that story because that's what she wanted to tell, what she wanted us to hear. And that's the thing that is tricky, especially with international development. I think humanitarian work is slightly different because there is an urgent need right now that we need to help and fix. You talked about like localism, that kind of localization. It's like, what is happening in that community? What are they doing? And how can we learn from that to take that to other communities? Not what can we bring from the UK over there? But we don't understand the context. Even the language, we don't understand. And the people who are working are the people on the ground in the communities, and they understand it so much better. I'm with you.
That story you told was really interesting. I think someone called Jess Crombie, she leads a lot of ethical storytelling in the international development sector. She did an experiment where they had a fundraising leaflet and they had a needy story and then one that was more empowering, and actually it didn't really make a difference in terms of how many people donated. So I think there is definitely that appetite for more stories from communities. And I think even some donors, like I know MasterCard Foundation, have moved all their operations to Nairobi to be closer to kind of what's happening on the African continent. And I think there is that appetite that the sector maybe just needs to catch up with a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Jess very well. We used to work together at Save the Children. Cool. It's a small world.
Yeah, everyone knows everyone.
I want to ask you a little bit about your kind of leadership style
Sure.
and how that's evolved over your career, and also how you've developed over those years and what the influences you had and maybe the barriers as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think I'm a relatively young and new leader. So I would say I'm still learning as I go. I would say I've learned that it's okay to ask questions. And that's a big part of my leadership style is just encouraging my team to ask questions or to come with any disagreements. When I first started out, I was quite introverted. I was quite shy. I wasn't necessarily the first person to put my hand up in a meeting and say, oh, maybe we should do this, or I don't quite agree with that. So I really try and encourage my team to voice their opinions. I like being told that I'm wrong. If you have a different idea, then let's go with that. And I think it's about my leadership styles definitely evolved to create safe spaces for my teams and play to each of my team members' strengths and make sure that there's different ways for people to contribute their ideas. So someone might not be the loudest voice in the room, but if they have an opportunity to contribute their idea, it might end up being the best one. So I think I've really tried to bring that feminist leadership to everything that I try and do with my team. And then I would say, in terms of the opportunities that I've had and getting to where I am, I've been really lucky in terms of the managers and kind of mentors I've had. I mentioned my head of marketing at Jakarta Travel, which was the travel industry. Layla Alcatan, she's an angel investor now, so she's doing something completely different. But she really gave me loads of opportunities and just said, yeah, if you've got an idea, let's run with it, or put me in rooms where I don't think a 23-year-old really should have been in. But yeah, she gave me loads of opportunities. And I think since then I've had mentors and managers. So at the RSC, my manager, Sydney Morton, was really key in getting our team that kind of visibility that I think you only get from a really good manager. So she made sure we all had opportunities to work with the CEO's team or messaging or with our VP or Chief Marketing Officer. So I think I've been really lucky in terms of the people around me that have helped open doors and got visibility in different spaces. And I think one of my mentors at the IRC, Peggy Walters, said to me that she was the director of comms. She said, you have to be in the rooms to get the opportunities, or you have to learn how to advocate for yourself as well. That's something I'm trying to pass on to my team at the moment and really advocate for them in rooms that they're not necessarily in and make sure they get the opportunities for visibility as well. It hasn't always been easy though. I'd say there's been some tricky bits as well. So there's been some organizations where I've worked for where I think as a woman of color, you're not necessarily first on the list to be promoted, even though you're the one doing all the work. And I think that links back to something Peggy told me when she was mentoring me. She said, kind of, just because you're doing the work doesn't mean everyone else knows that you're doing the work. So you have to get comfortable with really putting yourself out there, as cringe as it might feel. I think I've even started posting on LinkedIn more and putting myself out there and making sure I'm shouting about my work, which I think is something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to me. But I think it's something that unfortunately I feel like you have to do more as a woman of color than maybe the white man on your team that kind of is just getting the visibility as standard. So I'd say it's been a journey. I'm definitely still learning, but yeah, I think it's about not being afraid to ask questions, kind of encouraging my team to challenge me and come up with their own ideas, and then also facilitating kind of spaces where everyone feels comfortable enough to contribute their ideas, whether that was having everyone listen to a bit of music and put stuff on a Zoom whiteboard for a creative brainstorming session rather than just getting in a room and asking everyone what they think. Because I don't think that's necessarily going to bring out the best in every team member.
Going back to the tricky subject of race and people, you're doing the job and you're not going to get the promotion. You and I are both part of a network, the Asian Communications Network. And I think one of the reasons that network was created was because there aren't many Asian people in the communications world, in the not-for-profit, very few. And for me, it is about being seen, as you say, but also seeing people that look like us. When I started in comms 25 years ago, I was the only brown person in the room. And in some ways, that was good because people recognized me. But that was also quite sad that people recognized me because I was brown. So for me, it had its good and bad things about it. But now I feel when you've got this community of people around you and you can actually talk to them and they get you in a different way. And that's our community. It could be anyone else who's got their own communities in a similar way. But just being able to know that there's someone that looks like you or has a similar background to you. And we're all born here, we're all British Asians, but we're probably brought up slightly differently than other Brits. There is that connection that you have, I think, but also it means that the difficulties that you go through, you're not doing that on your own. So that's a little plug for Asian Comms Network.
I think it's a great network. It's something that relates to what I was saying as well around advocating for yourself. I think there was an event a few weeks ago where Vita Patel, who's one of the co-founders, was speaking about keeping a smile file. So having all your wins somewhere from each job that you have and having that to look back on so that you can advocate for yourself in different rooms when you need it. I think that was really interesting as well. And what you say about it being lonely is true as well. I remember I was on a team and I was the only brown person on the team when it was the race riots in the UK. And I didn't work on the team that had anything to do with communicating about the race riots. But then I think the leadership just came to me and was like, what do you think? And I was like, okay, well, it's good that you're asking me, but also why are you only asking me? Why don't you ask the people that are paid to do that work?
Yeah. And you will be asked to see things and give your opinion about it, which is a good thing. I always say, as you just said, it's for asking questions. People need to ask questions. If you don't know and if you don't understand somebody's culture, then ask the question. It's not offensive. It's just trying to understand each other better, which I think is really important in that sense. So I'll get off my little soapbox there. Let's go back to comms now. So how do you see the future of comms? How do you see it changing over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think there's obviously loads of stuff happening with AI, so I'm sure that's going to have a big impact on the sector. I think even things like people having to shift their PR strategies away from showing up in Google searches and actually showing up on kind of what people are typing into ChatGPT or Google Gemini is an interesting development. So I think there's definitely a lot of stuff happening with AI because a lot of AI can do the things like pulling a media list together or kind of doing kind of vetting requests. I think a lot of what comms professionals are going to have to do is more of the kind of reputational risk management and kind of being that ethical sounding board of, is it actually ethical to write this story in this way? I don't think that's something that AI can really advise on, which is good for those of us that work in the nonprofit sector. But I think another thing, especially to do with comms in the international development sector, I would say we've touched on this a little bit, but a lot of funding, a lot of charities are now looking at funding from kind of corporates and trusts and foundations rather than government. I think it'd be really interesting to see how communications teams adapt their communications so that they gain interest from those corporates and trusts and foundations rather than governments or just kind of the public at large. I think it's a bit of a different strategy and you have to think creatively about, okay, what's this bank going to be interested in from like this gender program that I'm working on, for example. And I think maybe there's an opportunity for nonprofits to be a bit more fun. I don't mean fun lightly, but a bit more brand focused. I was thinking about people who've inspired me that work in the comms sector before I came on this podcast and thinking about brands I've worked with and Duolingo's social media and how they have a really fun mascot who's like passive aggressive and that's really helped build their brand. Which I don't think that necessarily directly translates to the international development sector, but I think there's definitely some opportunity for more kind of brand moments and for the sector, especially for organizations in the sectors to become more well-known and less insular and stop speaking just to kind of governments and institutional partners, but more to corporates and kind of brands and get them on board as well with kind of supporting programs that are happening in the international development sector. So yeah, I think it'll be an interesting next 5 years to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, I guess that kind of idea of understanding the business and what are they going to get out of this?
Yeah.
Because it is, for them, it's not just CSR. If they're going to put money behind this, they need to know it's effective. They need to know that reputationally for their own brands, this fits nicely and why that fits. What are the long-term kind of goals, I suppose, as well. Yeah, you're right. It's a different way of thinking. That's a really good one. I like that. And just wrapping up and thinking about your kind of personal reflections, what keeps you motivated to carry on working in this sector?
Oh, that's a tough one. I've obviously worked in the private sector previously, so I definitely know that it's not for me in that sense. I've been lucky to have the experience of both. There's still so much work still to be done. Unfortunately, none of the humanitarian crises that are happening are going away anytime soon. And I think as long as there's communities that we're still able to support through the work that we're doing in the international development sector, I think that's something that will motivate me to keep going and that will really keep me in the sector. I don't think there's going to be, unfortunately, any less work to do anytime soon. And I think as well, It's interesting because I think everything that happened last year with sort of the rollback on kind of rights and funding for humanitarian and international development organizations actually has made a lot of people more motivated to stay in the sector and kind of push back against it and adapt to this new kind of funding landscape and make sure we're still telling the right stories and getting in front of the right people. I just really love it. And I think it's so rewarding when you get to meet a community member whose story you've helped tell. And I think that connection as well to communities is something that will keep me going, as well as trying to decolonize the sector, which I think will be a lifelong mission. So yeah, I'm definitely still in it for the long haul, I would say.
Fantastic. My final question to you is, what one piece of advice would you give to your younger self?
I have two. If I'm allowed to have two. One of them is if you don't ask, you don't get. And I would say that is definitely something I've learned. I think a lot of men in my life, even my husband, like he'll just ask things. And I'm like, wow, that's a bit bold. Like, why did you ask that question? But I think it's just programmed in to the way I guess men are brought up that it's like it's actually okay to ask. And you don't know what the answer's going to be unless you ask the question. So even if it's something like I've started negotiating my salaries when I go for new positions, which is something I never did when I first started out in the industry. And I think there is always stuff on the table, but you don't know if it's there unless you ask for it. So I'd say that's my main piece of advice. And then I would say to my younger self, and I guess anyone else who's listening who's maybe a bit more introverted, is to say, just because you're an introvert doesn't mean you can't pursue a career in comms. I think there's a bit of a perception around kind of you have to be loud and really extroverted and putting yourself out there all the time to pursue a career in the communications industry. I think there's actually real value in being a slightly more introverted and being able to build those kind of one-to-one relationships and maybe take a step back and think about something deeply and come back with a considered answer to a problem, which I think is a really valuable skill to have. And I wouldn't be put off pursuing a career in this industry just because I was a bit quieter or more introverted. So I think those would be my main two pieces of advice for my younger self. Yeah, I love that question.
Thank you so much, Sascha. It's been really good to talk to you.
Thanks so much, Vishnee. It's been such an interesting conversation. So thanks so much for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the Comms Collective. A huge thank you to Sascha for sharing her insights and experiences. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite app so that you never miss an episode. It would mean the world to me if you would rate and review the show. It helps more comms professionals like you discover these stories. And of course, join the conversation online, share this episode on social media, and tag us using the Comms Collective. Thank you for listening. I'm Vishnee Sontu, and I'm looking forward to bringing you more honest, inspiring conversations.